Hey everybody, welcome to our last video, I believe, of this unit. This is going to be focusing on photosynthesis. When we say we need energy, or we're going to be breaking down carbohydrates, or we're going to be eating our sandwiches, where does the energy ultimately come from for us to work with? And as you can tell from our title here, we're going to be looking at photosynthesis briefly in this video. The producers and consumers have sort of a different relationship here with the sun. Producers can absorb the sun's energy and convert it to chemical energy. And don't think that's not impressive. You can't do that. You cannot convert the sun's energy into ATP or any chemical form. You can say, I can get warm in the sun. Yeah, but warmth does not power chemical reactions the way ATP does. So the producers, like algae and plants and some bacteria, can use the sun's energy to actually produce their own food. Consumers then interact with the producers by eating them, and when they eat them, then a portion of that energy will transfer to them. So producers are going to do this. Producers are going to capture the solar energy and convert it to chemical energy, ultimately as a sugar. And you see here the solar energy is converted to chemical energy. If you have any sense of physics, you realize that you really can't create energy, you can only convert it. And so the plants are not producing the energy, even though we call them producers. They are converters. They are converting solar energy to chemical energy and storing that energy in the bonds of sugar. Remember from the last video, you require energy to make bonds. The bonds that are going to be used to make sugar are going to come from the sun. So in this case, CO2 plus water plus the sunlight is going to be used to make sugar and oxygen. So this is what's known as the overall inputs and outputs of photosynthesis. So producers are going to use CO2 from the air and water from the ground, use the sun, and through photosynthesis, through this series of enzymatic chemical reactions, they're going to attach and build a molecule of sugar that they can then later break down for energy. So we're not going to deal with the details of this very much, but we will focus on the idea that the reason we can't do this, but producers can, is producers have chloroplasts. They have these stacks of little green discs inside their chloroplasts, and it's inside these little discs that they can actually carry out the photosynthesis chemical reactions. So plants and algae are going to be able to, in these discs and in the space surrounding them, they're going to be able to carry out the chemical reactions that convert CO2 and sunlight and water into sugars. Okay, you can see organelles. These are the tiny little green discs that are in here. And again, the reason that we can't do it, we as consumers, is we don't have chloroplasts, so we can't carry out photosynthesis. Again, this is the overall reaction for photosynthesis, and I'm showing this to you again for a particular reason. Look carefully at this equation, and you should see something kind of weird and cool about this. Do you see it? It is the opposite of cell respiration. Remember, in cell respiration, we had sugars plus oxygen produced CO2 and water and energy. Here we have just the opposite. Photosynthesis and cell respiration are opposite reactions in metabolism, and we'll touch on that at the very end of the video. So here's an overview. So the plant is going to take up water from the ground. It's going to take in CO2 from the atmosphere. It's also going to give off oxygen in the process of photosynthesis. So these are the inputs, CO2 and water, and we're not showing you the sun on this picture. But ultimately, inside of the chloroplast, inside of these discs, please don't stress about the names of these parts here, but inside of these discs, then you're going to get the outputs. The output, primarily output, is going to be sugar, C6H12O6, glucose. Another byproduct, a waste product, if you will, is going to be oxygen. So, why are plants green? Maybe you've never thought about that, or maybe you have some sense of the answer. The reason they're green is they contain a pigment, basically a molecule that captures energy. And what this pigment does is it captures what's called the blue, violet, and the orange, red light of the sun, and it kind of bounces out green and yellow. So plants look green to us because plants don't absorb the energy from the sun that's at the green wavelength of light, but they absorb the reds and the oranges and the blues and the violets, and that's the energy wavelengths that powers the reactions of photosynthesis. So you see sunlight is going to come through, and they're showing you here the energy that's not absorbed. But the first part of photosynthesis is to capture the sun's energy. So the chlorophyll pigments, these molecules, capture the sun's energy. Some of that energy bounces away and is not used, and it makes the plant look green to us. But the other energy that is used is going to start exciting and producing chemicals inside of the plant. So the number one pigment molecule is chlorophyll. Okay. Oops, forgot to erase. Okay. Then part two of this is that energy that was captured and made into some energy molecules in step one. In step two, in part two, is going to be used to help attach CO2 and CO2 and CO2s to make sugar. What you're not seeing here, and it's important for me to add this so you see what we did. What we did in the first reaction, let me come back. Oops, let me come back over here. What we did, one more time, what we did in this whole reaction and in this whole system, we actually made some energy molecules. One of them happens to be our friend ATP. But what we're doing over here in this reaction is we're going to use the energy, we're going to use that energy, including ATP, from part one reactions to help drive this reaction. If you notice here, and don't stress about this too much, but notice we have one carbon here and we have 6 carbons there. So if we ran through this cycle multiple times, we're going to attach a CO2 and we're going to attach more carbon and more carbon every time. It kind of turns the crank, and ultimately we can produce sugars, and then finally this form of sugar, glucose. I'll erase this time. There we go. So the output from that reaction, from the Calvin cycle, what did we get? Ultimately, we got what's called G3P. It's a precursor, if you will. It's a molecule that can be used to ultimately produce quite a few things. So plants can use it to make glucose. And what they can do with this molecule actually is several things. They can use G3P, this product of the Calvin cycle, to make glucose, which they can use in cell respiration right away. Plants need energy too, so they're going to use that in cell respiration to release ATP to power their reactions. They may choose to store it. If there's plenty of glucose available, they may store it as starch, for example. Remember, starch is a polysaccharide. It's a bunch of glucoses chained together. Or they may use it for something like cellulose, a structural molecule to help make the parts, to make the wood, if you will, to make the leaves and the fibers that make up plants. Ultimately, of course, the only way consumers get the energy rather, is to consume the plants. So the insects, the rabbits, the cows, ultimately the energy that was captured from the sun and used to make the plant is transferred to the consumer. At least a small part of that energy is transferred to the consumer to make their plant, to make their tissues. Okay, and finally, I want to stress 2 points to you. One more time, producers and consumers use cell respiration. Producers are going to capture the energy from the sun in photosynthesis, yay. But to actually use the energy, both plants and animals carry out cell respiration. Here's how you can remember it. Plants have chloroplasts. That's for photosynthesis. Plants and animals have mitochondria. That's for cell respiration. And the final point, and it's a really important one for you to see, is this relationship between photosynthesis and cell respiration. Light energy comes in from the sun. Plants capture that energy and they make sugars and they make oxygen. In consumers, and plants and animals rather, with mitochondria, they're going to use sugars and oxygen to produce ATP and also produce a waste product, CO2, and produce water. Well, CO2 and water are used along with energy to make sugars and oxygen. Sugars and oxygen are going to be burned in mitochondria to produce CO2 and water and ATP. In other words, notice the connection between these two major processes. The products of one are going to be the reactants of the other. In other words, you have to have sugar and oxygen to carry out cellular respiration. You have to have CO2 and water to carry out photosynthesis. So these two hugely important metabolic reactions are linked together. You will see that idea again, I'm sure. That does it for this video. Thank you very much.